Okay,
now.
today we're going to look at the effects of the Protestant Reformation on German and Flemish art. Flanders, remember, is that Netherlandish, no longer existent place that is now the Netherlands and Belgium. Last week we had looked at the Flemish artist Hieronymus Bosch and the German artist Matthias Grunewald. We said that although they're of the same generation of Leonardo and Michelangelo, they seem so distant from Renaissance idealism, from the idea of the rebirth of the classical world, away from that Christian humanism of the Italian Renaissance, and more deeply rooted in the Middle Ages with its rather pessimistic view of human nature and a world that's populated not only by human beings, but by witches and demons and so forth, which were given such vital representation in the two kind of, I would say, late medieval artists. That's why there's a controversy about whether the Northern Renaissance should be called the Renaissance at all, because it does not break with the past the way it does in Italy, very self-consciously. Rather, it just sort of slowly morphs out of its Gothic background. Well, if you have to talk about the Protestant Reformation, we're leaving out Dürer, who's going to be the subject of our next lecture, and he's really the major Renaissance artist, but he was a Catholic, so I thought it would be good to introduce Luther and his ideas and their impact on the arts. And a lot of the impact on the arts was not positive of the Protestant Reformation, because it was a strong iconoclastic dimension to the Protestants. Lucas Cranach is a king of the Protestant artists. He lived in Saxony, in Wittenberg. He was a personal friend of Martin Luther, who was the godfather to his children. And so Cranach, more than any other artist, embodies Lutheran ideology. And he does several different portraits of Luther. And here's one of them, one of my favorite ones. And here you can see this, this very intelligent man, again, with this northern insistence and detail. Look at how each eyelash is individually painted in, how each little stubble on his beard of his 5 o'clock shadow. And the artist doesn't back away from those kind of homely details, but delights in them. And also creates a really powerful, I think, psychological portrait of Luther, who is a very, very complex character and on the world stage, and prominent intellectual. And again, I just wanted to get the close-up of this incredibly, but again, very linear, very, very linear. The Northern artists were concerned with line and building character. And here you can see still in his habit. And he was an Augustinian monk and a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg in the German state of Saxony. Germany didn't exist at that time. Germany didn't exist till 1870, but it was this mishmash of different small states, many of the northern of which broke from Rome during the 1500s under the influence of Martin Luther. So if we're going to understand, and really the Renaissance in a way comes to the north, not by way of philosophy or interest in antiquity, but in a critical reaction of a prominent individual. And so Luther in many ways is the Renaissance man in the sense of being very cognizant that his individualism is what leads him to the Protestant revolt. His personal doubt about certain things in the Catholic faith. Now it's interesting, and this is what makes Luther an interesting case for us to look at, is that he bases his whole theology on salvation by faith. Yet Luther's major contribution to the history of Western thought is his doubt about purgatory, his doubt about the efficacy of the saints, his doubt about indulgences and various practices of the Roman Catholic faith. And he came to insist, however, despite that doubt, that faith was the rock and the foundation of salvation. And by faith, he didn't mean a general faith in the goodness of all things or anything like that. He meant specifically salvation in faith in the death of Jesus. And you can see in this painting by him where Luther, shown on the right in a pulpit, is giving one of his fiery sermons. He was supposed to be a very good preacher. And then the audience of people in contemporary dress look at Luther, and he points to not a crucifix, but to the living, the living, dying Jesus taking flesh right there in front of them. And this is a metaphor also for the Eucharist, which the Lutherans saw as very kind of atonement. Atonement theology is what we call that. And that is, it believes strongly in original sin and in a sort of natural depravity of man. And that the only way to atone for this tendency for sinfulness is by death of a sacrificial victim. And so just like the lamb had been slain at Passover by the ancient Jews, now, according to Augustinian Christianity anyway, there is this atonement. As in Adam all die, so in Christ will all be made alive. But there's this emphasis on his death. Okay, so I don't want to get into all this theology, but I wanted to speak, because sometimes Chronic does works that are actually theology in paint. And here's a good example, and it's called the Allegory of the Law and the Gospel. And what it does, it's a diptych, a two-part thing, and it tells the story for the illiterate of the damnation, the fall, and the salvation of mankind. So let's just go through the iconography. We'll start here on this side. And we can see here in the background is Adam and Eve, and they're being tempted by the serpent. Up in the clouds is not God the Father, but Jesus, and a resurrected Jesus, even though it's the beginning of time, because he actually has holes. You see those marks in his hands and feet, which is a curious identification of Jesus with, God. And then, of course, in the middle ground, poor wretched soul is driven into hell by death and the devil. And there's the flames of hell and the monsters that are in there that are waiting for him his just rewards for the sinfulness of his nature, which was inherited according to Lutheran and Augustinian Christianity by original sin. That original sin is a propensity to sin that everybody has, and we can't undo it, and we can't, good works don't help. Here's an interesting detail. Down here in the corner are Jewish figures from the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And here is Moses in the front, dressed as a well-to-do merchant with his tablets of the Ten Commandments. And looks very, very, very worried and distressed. And he seems to discuss this with other, I suppose, which are intended to be prophets, Isaiah and so forth, but they're dressed as modern Jews, as well-to-do Jews, and so there is this, anti-Semitic kind of part to this Lutheran theology. Okay, so then if we go to that's the law. And the law really won't save people, and that's why everyone is so distressed. But if only they got the major point that Luther was making, in that the blood of Jesus makes the law old-fashioned and not necessary anymore. And here, again, the iconography, if you go to these upper left corner, that was Adam and Eve in the first panel, is now the strange story from Exodus of when the Hebrews are wandering through the desert. Snakes, God gets angry at them for some reason, and snakes fall from heaven and bite people and kill them, and the poison snakes. And Moses asks God to relieve them of this distress, and he says, make a brazen serpent hanging on the tree, and those that have been bitten, when they gaze at the brazen serpent, they will be healed. And so that's what this is. The Hebrews are shown in their tents because they're nomadic, right? They're wandering through the desert as they did after the emancipation from Egypt. And so here, and there's all sorts of snakes writhing on the ground, and here's this brazen serpent. It's a strange, very obscure thing, and actually scholars think that it might indicate some sort of monotheistic religious practices in the area that were kind of integrated into the Torah in that way. It's a strange story. Clearly, the point here is that as Adam was tricked by a serpent on a tree, now this new serpent on the tree heals. And it's all a metaphor for Jesus. Mary in the upper right-hand corner tells the whole story, right? In one picture. Mary is pregnant, she's praying, and at the same time, the angel is appearing to the shepherds in Bethlehem. Jesus is being crucified, and you can see that from that wound in his side that the spear came out, blood comes pouring out in a stream, and a dove comes out of this because the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, according to Lutheran theology, and it falls right on the chest of the soul. And Jesus here appears again to kind of comment on it all and explain to this soul that it's through this blood that you are made whole. And on the other side is shown the empty tomb. It's right, I told you it's the whole story, right? Empty tomb, Jesus defeats the devil and death, tramples on them. It's very Boschian in its own way. And then one of the most charming aspects of this painting, I think, is how Jesus ascends into heaven. It's just his feet is all we see up there. You know, it tells this story. And Jesus points to the lamb that's kind of in the center. And that's a reference to the lamb that was sacrificed at Pesach, at Passover in the Old Testament. So that this is an Old Testament and a New Testament. Now, needless to say, this is not a very fair picture of Judaism. Judaism is a much richer tradition than just simply, you know, as a prelude to Christian theology. So, but this is what I'm always telling my students. You know, you don't have to believe all the things that the people believed in to understand and to appreciate the painting. And what I think is important here, it's really a whole lesson. And especially if you look at, there's a print version he did of it. And the prints, of course, could be multiples and they could be much cheaper. And I can just imagine a Lutheran minister pinning up this print in front of his congregation or maybe his students for baptism or for, what do they call it, confirmation. Showing, and all the parts of the thing, according to Luther, are shown in a print like this. And in fact, the printing press and prints were very, very, very important to the Protestant Reformation, because unlike earlier people who had tried to reform the church, like, for example, the Bohemian preacher Jan Hus was burned at the stake. When they burned him at the stake, they took all his writings and they threw them into the fire. So we don't know what he said. We have they destroyed all his works. With Luther, it was different because of Gutenberg and movable type, and his essays were circulating. So even if they burned Martin Luther at the stake, which they want to do, the movement would not have died. And it's because of this new technology. And the new technology, the printing press and movable type, and the availability of paper, because although Muslims had paper right back into the Middle Ages, in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, artists worked on parchment. They worked on lambskin or calf skin, very expensive, each sheet is, they're very expensive. Paper is inexpensive, you can make it quick. And so the ideas, both visual and written, could be circulated widely, and that's one of the reasons of the success of Luther. And that's why when he was brought to a church trial, and they said, you can kill my body, but you can't kill the truth. He meant it because it's true, but also it's true that his printed word, the cat was out of the bag. People were practicing Lutheranism. Priests were getting married, things like that. Okay, so I wanted to show that because I thought it was an interesting how theology can kind of be represented that way as a very teaching thing. You can see what a a teaching sort of medium it was, and how much the Reformation is part of that. Now, an interesting aspect of chronic, and I'm not sure of the real success of a painting like that one that I just showed you, although it's a wonderful like lesson plan, its ultimate worth, I think, is to a certain level dubious. Now, this has to do with Chronic. Chronic was an incredible, he had a huge workshop. He was as large as Raphael's studio was in Rome, that is with 50, 60, 70 people working under him. This was also true of the Chronic family. Lucas the Elder, his father was a painter. Lucas the Younger is his son. He had Vasari said, a 3-story studio. And he just had these projects going on all the time. And his son and the assistants that they trained so perfectly embody the maestro's style that it becomes a connoisseur's, nightmare to figure out which of these are and how much of them are actually by Chronic the Elder. But this one we're very sure of. And it's as charming and lovely as any painting from the Renaissance that I can think of. The colors are luminous. There's this crispness to the air, almost as if a light frost has just come. This is the Mary and Jesus as a baby, and Joseph having fled, according to Gospel of Matthew, having fled from Herod's massacre of the children, were warned by an angel to flee into Egypt, and so they go into Egypt. And there's a rest on the flight to Egypt. But Egypt doesn't seem to be in the Holy Land, but rather in the Teutoburg forest. And the landscape is just breathtaking. And this is a very important aspect of the Northern Renaissance, landscape. Landscape came to embody all different sorts of emotions, and an exquisite development of landscape painting was a thing that we see in the North and we don't see in Italy until much later. Here there are whole sorts of charming angels that wait on and serve the Holy Family. Here is a rock split, water coming out of the rock, which is a reference to Moses in the desert. The Hebrews were thirsty and he hit a rock and out came water. So it's another Moses kind of story. And then down here, these lovely angels play a little concert, I guess, to amuse the Holy Family. It's not clear, however, that they all see the angels. We see the angels. Jesus sees the angels. He reaches out, wanting to touch them, but Mary and Joseph don't seem to be aware of them. Perhaps they're even the innocents that were massacred by Herod. Joseph is very old, as he's often pictured, just to show that he doesn't really have anything to do with this child other than being his foster father and protector. And he eyes the viewer a little suspiciously, actually, but he's very protective in a fatherly uncle sort of way. Mary is just this most charming German girl, a lovely smile, a teenager. It's just so lovely. It was a great pleasure of mine. While I was at graduate school, I was sent to teach in southern Germany, in Konstanz am Bodensee, and very near the Alps. And you can see this kind of alpine background here. So this kind of, and this frosty morning landscape where the angels come to wait on the Holy Family in this lovely forest, and very unidealized trees, very irregular kind of trees, like they are in southern Germany. He can also use it to use landscape, that is, to paint tragedy. So here, as Jesus breathes his last and dies, these dark clouds come rolling in. In the corner, we can see this incredibly desert-like, parched landscape, void of human content. It's not Jerusalem, but more like a desert. The figures of Mary and the disciple John weep as they see Jesus has died. He has fallen in death, and blood sort of drips from his wounds as this wonderful dark clouds ominously come in, signaling the tragedy, the high tragedy of this needless death. The two thieves who are crucified on either side of Jesus are on the left. We can see both of them there. Notice also in the background, that's another touch of these two or three trees in the background. The one closest to us is dead, and its tendrils reach up toward that cloud as if to embrace the death, as if to embrace the impending darkness. But behind it is a birch, and behind that a tree that is in full of foliage. And so this is to hint that this dark, tragic scene is not the ultimate end. That beyond the dead tree is the living tree full of life, an indication of the resurrection of Jesus. So at the same time that it's a very, very mournful and sad and dark picture in its mood, it also has these seeds of redemptive resurrection in the end. Okay, so that's Cranach, and Cranach, he's a wonderful landscape painter. He also does mythological subjects. Here, for example, is the Judgment of Paris from ancient Greek mythology, and in fact, Paris judged a beauty contest of three of the goddesses, Aphrodite, I forget which three, Hera, maybe Diana, I forget. And it's kind of a beauty contest. So here, Paris is shown not as a Greek youth, but as a knight, as a German knight, against this incredible background that looks like the Danube. And it has cliffs in the background and a little castle up on the top, as well as a road that winds its way back into that landscape. It's a wonderful landscape in itself, and but it does form a background, and it does not compete with a beauty contest that's taking place in the foreground. And Cupid, of course, is up here, mischievous Cupid, and he's going to land in the heart of Venus, and who's shown very fashionably. Now I want to point out, and on the left is a small Raphael piece from a predella, and it's the Three Graces. And I brought it in just to show you, just about the same time, a little later, the Cranach is doing these three ideal beauties that are being judged by Paris. And notice what a different body type. Instead of this, full-hipped, rounded forms that the Italians get from the Romans and the Greeks, their ideal of feminine beauty, kind of slightly corpulence, is very different than the ideals of beauty in Germany, where these slim-hipped beauties, small-breasted, slim-hipped beauties are vying for our attention. It's interesting that they wear only like hat and jewelry and nothing else. So there's this partial dress is kind of erotic touch to the whole thing. How the goddess on the right glances over her shoulder provocatively at the viewer. I wanted to point out also in the Raphael, the background, the landscape. There is a landscape, enough of a landscape that you know that they're on the earth somewhere. There's water, there's some hills, but it's extremely indistinct and generalized, because Raphael, everything is the human presence, and landscape is but a background for that. That's really very different than the rich, lush landscapes that we find emerging on a German artists around this time. and how much of the story can actually be told in terms of landscape, just without even the figures. But what I want to emphasize here is this changing ideal of beauty, because the Italians had this idea that there were ideal proportions that were in the mind of God, and that they were trying to discern those proportions and give them a form. And so Italians would think that these slim-hipped women, the artist just wasn't in touch with these eternal verities of form. But the problem with that is, ideas of beauty shift and change. And the idea that there's one particular kind of beauty, I think that this is something that's done a lot of damage to women's psyches over the years. When you think of all the eating disorders and stuff that young women sometimes go through that these ideals change, and therefore they're really not eternal. And there's different types of beauties besides this young feminine beauty that Raphael shows so beautifully. I mean, I'm convinced, but there's a difference also as well in the North. And I remember in my own lifetime, when I was a little boy, the most beautiful women were Elizabeth Taylor and Marilyn Monroe and Kim Novak, very full, rounded kind of figures. And then Twiggy came in, and fashion changed, and these very slender hipped women kind of became almost overnight the new ideal for women. And it just shows you to what extent these ideas are not eternal verities, but are culture bound. Ideas of beauty are culture bound, like everything else out of it. I just thought I'd bring this in. This is also by Chronic, a very kind of sexy and provocative female nude. And it's called a Venus, but I think it's just, basically a lovely, provocative, sexy woman. But it is interesting that she doesn't seem to have any bones in her body at all. It's as if she's just, almost made of jello or something like that. This kind of almost snake-like quality of her arms. It's really quite extraordinary, and very much outside of the ideals of proportion that were the canons of art in Italy. And this is why these sorts of things, when they were seen by Italians, were seen as a rude, work of the Germans. But if you can get past that, and I have prejudices toward Italian art, it's a different thing. You have to kind of change gears and move into this. You can see it's a very erotic and very sensual portrayal of the nude, but with different proportions than the Italians. Albrecht Altdorfer is an obscure artist, but he did the first landscapes. That is, landscapes that did not really concern human beings. Although, of course, there is this little town in the background here. This is a ink and watercolor piece by Altdorfer. And in the background, we see this little tiny village just kind of nestled in this little valley, and we're standing on a hill above it. Notice how the trees are not idealized either. So the figure is not idealized, the trees are not idealized. We have these dead trees in the very, very center of this clump of trees. So we can see here that we're not in this idealized world, but we're in the real world. And this is a real little town with its Gothic roofs and everything. And so Altdorfer completely dispenses with and does the first pure landscapes in European art. Here's another one. He lived near the Danube River, beautiful as it winds its way northward. And he sets kind of the standards for landscape painting as it will develop over the following centuries, because landscape becomes a major art form and genre especially for the 19th century in Romanticism. It just reaches its height. But this is where it all begins, with the expressive power of landscape. It's not just a decorative background to something else. And it's not just something that reinforces the tragedy of the crucifixion or whatever, but it's something that stands alone and has its own expressive power just in its own sake. And one of the things that he pioneers is this thing which in French they call repoussoir, and that is a sort of a framing device. And he uses here, see, and he's founding these conventions, but these two trees that stand on either side of the path. So we seem to be on the path, and these trees tower over us and form a sort of natural frame. And their fluffy qualities are continued in the clouds that kind of dance in the sky. We see that the path that we're on weaves its way through the edge of the forest to a little hamlet in the background, nestled among the on the side of the river and among these little hills. It's just a beautiful and lovely and completely self-contained. And I think this is an interesting development that will continue to develop through the Dutch Baroque of the 1600s, and then have reaching its height perhaps in 19th century Romantic painting. Here's this very kind of spooky scene. Also looks very romantic to us, but it is Altdorfer. There is a little figure, but the little figure just is there just for scale. It really doesn't tell a story. We don't empathize with this figure, but we have an idea of the immenseness of this evergreen tree that's in the very center of the painting, and seems to be the major subject of the painting, not the figure. It's the tree that sort of imposes itself in the center. There is, of course, references to human habitation. There is a dirt path that winds itself around this grand evergreen tree into the background. We see in the background the ruins of a church, and that's what adds to its atmospheric, almost I said spooky or romantic qualities, because the dilapidated church may have meaning for either Protestants or Catholics, right? Viewing a landscape like this, then I think it's that ambiguity. This could either be the Catholic Church, which is now left in ruins, or it could be a metaphor for the Protestants, passing beyond that. Or it could even be seen by Catholics as a comment on Protestantism, how Protestantism defeats Christianity and makes it into but the ruins of what it once was under Catholics. So these sorts of philosophical debates are embedded in these landscapes. They're not pure landscapes. They're not just there to arouse our emotions. But I think that a painting like this, to me, is a very powerful new genre of art. And the Germans and the Flemish in the north are the people who open the way for it. And it's not an idealized sort of forest. Or a tree. It's a very kind of irregular tree, kind of twisting its way up. It's beautiful. Here, this dense foliage in a painting. And here it actually does have a sacred theme. It's St. George defeating the dragon, a famous, story from Christian lore that is, told and retold in a lot of stories. But usually it's easier to find St. George and the dragon. And if we look closely, they're in the bottom portion of the painting. Very small, very almost incidental. You could, the painting could stand on its own if you did some Photoshop, eliminated St. George and the dragon. I think the painting completely stands on its own as an expression of this kind of lush summer, where everything, it's not the kind of spring green that we see now, but this lush, fully ripe summer day. And it's almost like St. George and the Dragon is the excuse for him to paint this marvelous, dense, deciduous forest with all the implications of a forest and the journey and the pilgrim as he goes through, and seeing the clearing as that seems to be opening up out of this dense forest just beyond the saint and the dragon that he defeats. And it's interesting to what a back seat the dragon and the St. George take. It's almost like the major part of the story is told just by the landscape of that we are in journey of life. We go through dense forest, but if we stick to the path, we'll emerge into the bright sunlight of a meadow in the background. And so, don't think that these are purely picturesque, because they do embody ideas about human existence, but they're moving farther and farther and farther away from a specifically Christian expression and kind of becoming more universal. I think it's one reason that Altdorfer is so significant, even though there are very few of his paintings that remain. Now, I want to move back to Flanders to talk about really my favorite artist of the ones we've talked about. I've been saving him for the end, and that is Peter Bruegel the Elder. Sometimes you will hear art historians pronouncing it Peter Bruegel, and I used to do that, but that's how it would be pronounced if it's German, but it's not. It's Dutch, and he's Peter Bruegel. And this is to distinguish him from his son, Peter Bruegel, or Velvet Bruegel, the Baroque painter who worked with Rubens. So again, it's one of these family lineages. Now, Peter Bruegel first came to prominence for his, and he worked in printmaking, engraving, as a carrier on of Bosch's style. He looks, this is called Big Fish Eat Little Fish, and it really looks like a Hieronymus Bosch painting. Remember, we had seen the Garden of Earthly Delights last week with all this crazy bird, animal hybrids, pictures of people being tortured in hell, all these strange sort of things. And Bruegel can do it just as well as Bosch. He's actually born about 10 years after Bosch dies. So Bruegel, we're talking we're someone who comes into his own in the 30s. And he starts as this new Bruegel. Now, as a new kind of Bosch. And he's kind of dismissed by a lot of art historians in the past. Vasari, the Italian art historian, says he's just kind of a new Bruegel, a new Bosch. And he's kind of just seen as that. And that's unfortunate, because I think Bruegel is a much more important painter, even though these early commissions, and he does Bosch's style beautifully, and he adds to the kind of repertoire of that phantasmagoria for us. But I think ultimately he moves beyond that Boschism of his early work and really establishes himself as the premier landscape artist and depictor of genre scenes. But just to give you a taste of one of his ghastly early paintings in the style of Bosch, this is called The Triumph of Death. And skeletons form armies in the middle ground. Haywain is thrown with corpses. In the background, these strange, look at torture instruments, like with wheels on the top of them. Very, surrealistic Salvador Dali kind of a thing. It goes back into the background with this impending dark storm. When you live in the Midwest, it's very flat, like it is in the Netherlands. And these, they're tornadoes. And that's the way a tornado looks, is that way. This brightness and then this real darkness hanging over it. And this is the time when it's right for that. It's interesting here because, of course, death conquers all in the end. And we could do it. And he does one of Carnival and Lent. He does a lot of things that also embody anecdotes. Very successful artist. starts his career in Antwerp. He does go to Italy. He goes to Italy, goes over the Alps, but he's not very influenced by Italian art. He gets to Rome, he goes even to Sicily, spends some time there. But unlike Dürer, who really picks it up and loves Italian art, Bosch doesn't seem that affected. It seems to me, Bruegel isn't that affected by his sojourn in Italy. It doesn't make his work more idealistic or anything like that. But one thing that did really impress him was going over the Alps. And so he does bring mountainous landscapes, which of course the Netherlands are lowlands. They're very low, they're very flat. So he does a lot of these anecdotes that people from the time would recognize. And this is one that we still recognize because it comes out of the Gospels. And Jesus tells a parable of when the blind lead the blind, they all fall into a ditch. And what he means is if you follow disreputable leaders, you'll all be doomed. You have to think for yourself. You can't blindly follow leaders. And this might have been a commentary either on a Protestant or a Catholic side. But here, these blind people all touching each other with their canes. One has fallen into the ditch. All will soon accompany them. In the background, we see peasant huts with these thatch roofs on the left. So this establishes it in the countryside. And on the right, we see, a Gothic church, a country church with its steeple. Then this could be, it doesn't seem that, so there is a reference to the church, but exactly what it is and exactly who are those who are blind is left up to the interpretation of the individual. This, by the way, was the basis of a wonderful painting from the time of the First World War by, of all people, John Singer Sargent, where these people who have been blinded by mustard gas are all, and he does it. It's a wonderful commentary on the futility of the First World War. And he goes right back to Bruegel to get it. So Bruegel, and look at these people, these are not upper class people, these are poor blind people. And Bruegel loves the countryside and he loves peasant life. And he lives for a while in Antwerp, but then moves to Brussels. He continues to be very successful. He dies around 39, 41, somewhere in there. We're not sure his birth date exactly. But he and this prince, or bourgeois, one of his patrons that bought and commissioned Bruegel's work, they would get dressed up as peasants and crash weddings for fun, and kind of, experimenting with lowlife, I suppose, getting drunk with the peasants and so forth. And Bruegel gives, a really elegant representations of them. They're not individual people. He sees them kind of as a type. And so this is a new genre of art, because art had previously shown either mythological scenes or biblical scenes or scenes of upper class life, the life of the people who were paying for it. Peasants don't have enough money to buy paintings. They struggle just to put, bread on the table. But here, Kermis, village festival, and you can see a bagpipe player in the foreground, and his buddy hands him this big jug of beer. This couple enter from the right, that wonderful thatched roof. Seems a very, very small little hamlet here. Coarsely dressed peasants. Look at the clumsiness kind of the woman, her big foot going out. They're getting ready to dance. There's this kind of clumsy quality to it. So I think this is an upper class view of peasant life. And I suppose it could be seen as slumming, especially when the circumstances of how he studied his subjects. But I think nonetheless, and there is a certain patronization going on here, but nonetheless, I think he sees peasants as more in touch with nature than high-class people are. And their coarseness is not something really to be made fun of. as much to kind of observe and almost and enjoy and almost to kind of envy. Because I think one of the, life in aristocratic courts, in upper class bourgeois uh, villas, this life was not as interesting as or as colorful or as real. I think he felt that peasants are more connected to the earth. And this gets us to his, again, he's an amazing landscape painter as well as this. I want to mention too, that over here are blind people. This table has been set up for blind people over there. It's an interesting way of integrating those people, that small minority within the community there. And these have been read as anecdotes in various different ways, as metaphors, embodying sayings from the time. Here's another one of a peasant wedding, another wedding, I guess they crashed. This takes place in a barn. This barn was only the big enough place to get all the people in that they needed, because they're peasants, they don't have small houses. And so here these servants, the caterers, I guess, bring soup, hot soup to serve the family. Back here is the bride herself. There's kind of a green blanket hung up above her. Over here, a bagpipe musician plays bagpipes. Here, a guy fills up a jug with beer. Even a little kid, has beer down there. And it does seem like a very robust, they have the figures have a robustness and a monumentality, a Michelangelo-esque almost quality. They're thick. They have great gravitas. They seem to be really connected to the earth. Now, some people have pointed out that this friar talking to a high-class man, but tradition has held that that's Bruegel himself or his patron that used to go slumming among the peasants. But I, despite this like patronization, I still think it's a very loving portrayal of people. But he does have cartoonists or a caricaturist's sensibilities as well, and a keen eye for the foibles and the pretensions of human beings. This one showing a painter who looks very grisly, as if he has not combed his hair in years, sort of a stereotype of maybe the rough artist. And behind him, this connoisseur with his very strange nose and his little spectacles, as he seems to be looking at the work of art. We don't see the work of art, always said the artist and the connoisseur. And I think it's called the connoisseur. It's a lighthearted, friendly criticism of the pretensions of people who commission art, and maybe also a swipe at the roughness of artists, that they could be more refined. But again, it's that rough peasant kind of coarseness that I think he really sees as an aesthetic. He does, I think, the highlight of his career for a patron in Antwerp. He does a series we think were supposed to be the 12 months, of which only 5 survive. Some art historians think there were only 6, and they actually represent 2 months. This is a spring scene in February or March, very gloomy, very dark. The trees are all completely bare. These figures are pruning the trees, which is something you do in February or March. So we think that that's what this is. There's a real wind blows the trees to the side. The water in the background is all choppy as these little boats try to navigate that river. And down, we're standing on a hill and overlooking, and you see the thatched houses that kind of wind their way down the hill to this little village below. And again, it's the figures, although they're, they show human presence and illustrate their relationship to nature because they're pruning the trees. Nonetheless, it's mostly a landscape. And it's the kind of dark, gloomy, overcast, windy days of March that prefigure a spring. And already the people are into pruning the trees before spring completely breaks through. And you get a sense of this, the end of the winter kind of farewell. It has an elegiac kind of quality as well. One of my favorites is this one, which ended up at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You can go see it when you're there. And they're all about the same size. They're meant as pendants to each other as a series. And this is harvest time. I guess it must be August, something like that. Here, peasants have stopped in their harvesting of the wheat, and you can see them, thrashing it and then putting it into these piles here. They're stopping for lunch. They're all having soup and kind of hats on and so forth. Here, one guy decides to take a little nap, as a respite from the work. But here what we see, and this we don't see in Bosch or the earlier people, is that Bruegel is completely conversant in perspective. And we're not, whether he gets it through Dürer or through his travels in Italy, this is the deep, deep space of linear perspective. And as you look off into the horizon, he also begins to, you can see there's kind of a haze that hangs over this August day. It's a very hot day. And this kind of heavy dew or mist hangs over it. You can see it as you look into the background, how it just fades into this haze. And it looks like a little port there, as well as some activity in the fields down there. So, and then again, the church, ever present. There's always a church. Church is right here. Church is part of, not so much a thing in itself as part of the whole sequence of life of spring and autumn and harvest and winter and all of them together. My favorite in the series is this one, Hunters in the Snow. It's one of my favorite paintings of all time. And here you can see again the deep space of perspective. So he knows how to control the landscape. Then these hunters return with their dogs, and they only have one fox. So this was not a very successful hunt. You can use the pelt of a fox, but you don't eat foxes. And the hunters are shown from the back. And you can see the kind of rough outfits. Their hunting dogs are with them. In the background, these people are braising a hog. I get the very first thing that you do. So this is December. So this is coming up on the Christmas holiday. And this is the braising of the hog is kind of part of that Christmas celebration in the Netherlands. So he shows, again, people connected to the earth. If we look down to the valley, just this lovely, alpine scene. It's not the Netherlands. It's not flat. It's not the Netherlands. He's conjuring up that alpine scenes that he saw from his youth. So as the hunters return, they come over the hill and look down on this beautiful valley where children and adults are skating on the pond. There's a woman here with a whole bunch of fuel. She's been picking up twigs and take it home to start a fire. Everything is covered with snow. It has that crisp lucidity of winter light, where even things in the distance are not very hazy. There's that kind of crispness to everything. So see, he understands these nuances of light, of winter light as compared to as the hazy light of August. Again, ever present is the church that kind of unites everyone. But it's the beginning of genre scenes where we see into the life of these people, conceived of by Bruegel and by his benefactors, by his patrons, as somehow more in touch with the seasons and with nature, and by extension with God, because they're part of this rhythm of life and the cycles of the seasons. I think one of the most extraordinary things in this painting is this one bird right here, and how it's almost like the whole composition kind of centers around this bird, which is the kind of keystone to this magnificent winter landscape. So Bruegel is not just, latter-day Bosch. He starts that way, comes out of that tradition, but he grows into a full ripeness of founding really, in many ways, a whole genre of peasant depictions of peasant life, which is called genre painting, and as well as a pioneer in the expressive use of the landscape. Now, next week, we're going to be looking at Albrecht Dürer, who is sometimes called the Leonardo